In the dim glow of a faltering torch, beneath stone vaults that had witnessed centuries of whispers, a scribe unrolled an aging scroll said to contain the most forbidden tales of medieval royalty. This was no chronicle of battles or treaties. It was a record of scandal, the kind of scandal that reshaped kingdoms in the shadows. For behind every polished crown there always lurked a secret, and behind every royal smile there often hid a sin great enough to crumble empires. It began with the tale of King Aldervan of the Western Isles, whose life was a storm of unpredictable decisions that left both nobles and peasants baffled. He was known as the king who trusted no one yet told everyone everything. His worst flaw was his mouth. He gossiped more than any old market vendor, spreading private state secrets as casually as he handed out bread during festivals. Council meetings were a disaster. Whatever was agreed upon before dawn was known by the entire city before noon. His advisors once devised a plan to store grain for winter, a simple but vital strategy. But by the next morning, Aldervan had already announced to a group of traveling merchants the exact location of the grain stores, how much was held, and the types of locks used. The grain was stolen 2 nights later. But Aldervan's scandals did not end there. He had an uncontrollable need to impress, and this desire dragged him toward eccentricities that baffled even his closest allies. He once attempted to build the largest bathhouse in the continent, funded entirely by taxes meant for repairing the city walls. The walls crumbled months later, leaving the capital vulnerable. Meanwhile, Aldervan proudly invited foreign diplomats into a marble bath complex while citizens lived in fear of bandits. His obsession with grandeur made him a walking catastrophe, and every diplomatic attempt collapsed under the weight of his impulsive behavior. Yet Aldervan was only the beginning. Far to the east reigned Malik II of the Dawn Empire, whose reputation was far stranger. Malik believed himself not merely a king, but a prophet chosen by celestial forces. He surrounded himself with astrologers who interpreted the stars, every flicker as a message meant solely for him. No policy was implemented unless the night sky approved. If a comet appeared, he cancelled court meetings for weeks. If an eclipse darkened the sun, he forbade anyone from leaving their homes until the heavens forgave humanity. His most notorious scandal involved his so-called Harmony Gates, massive stone arches erected around the capital, each inscribed with prophetic symbols that Malik claimed would ward off misfortune. But the arches were so badly designed that they collapsed repeatedly onto the streets, crushing wagons, causing riots, and blocking trade routes for months. Malik insisted the gates had fallen in symbolic protest, and ordered more to be built, each one larger and more unstable than the last. The people whispered that the sky itself was weary of his madness. While Malik listened to the heavens, King Torhelm of the northern marshes listened only to himself. His pride was legendary, and his scandals grew from his refusal to accept any reality but his own. Torhelm was convinced he was the strongest man alive. To prove it, he organized weekly contests where he challenged knights, farmers, and even ambassadors to wrestling matches. It became court tradition foreign diplomats expected to negotiate in the morning and wrestle the king in the afternoon. Humiliation reigned when Torhelm lost. Once, a visiting merchant from the east effortlessly pinned him to the ground, and Torhelm flew into such rage that he banned all trade with the merchant's homeland. This ban lasted 7 years, nearly destroying the kingdom's economy. But his most ridiculous disaster came during a winter festival. Torhelm wanted to demonstrate his dominance by defeating a bear in combat. His advisors begged him to reconsider, but Torhelm refused. The bear escaped into the audience, the arena collapsed, nobles fled screaming, and the king was left with a broken leg and a bruised ego. Instead of admitting defeat, Torhelm blamed the architects and had them redesign the arena 3 more times, each one more absurd than the last. Meanwhile, across the sea, King Rodrian the Golden ruled a land of wealth and beauty, yet his reign was anything but golden. Rodrian was obsessed with appearances. His entire rule revolved around maintaining an immaculate image of perfection. He spent fortunes on silk, jewels, and cosmetic powders, demanding that every portrait make him appear younger than the one before. His court painters lived in constant terror, for one wrinkle drawn incorrectly could cost them their lives, not to mention their hands. Rodrian once ordered his palace floors polished so thoroughly that they became mirrors. Visitors slipped and crashed across the hallways, turning matters of state into slapstick tragedy. Courtiers devised elaborate methods to navigate the reflective death trap shoes wrapped in cloth, crawling instead of walking or simply refusing to enter the palace altogether. Rodrian mistook their avoidance for admiration and declared that the palace would shine like the sun forever. It didn't, so did his reputation for vanity. Then there was King Berengar, the hoarder, whose private chambers were stuffed with objects he claimed were sacred artifacts. Among them were broken swords, chipped pottery, mislabeled scrolls, and even pebbles he believed to be magical. His obsession grew until his living space became a labyrinth of pointless objects. Servants occasionally got lost inside, wandering between stacks of discarded items like travelers trapped in an ancient ruin. Once, a court jester disappeared for 3 days before emerging covered in dust, babbling about a hidden corridor made entirely of old boots. Berengar's hoarding turned political when he began confiscating items from nobles under the claim that they radiated destiny. This included armor pieces, furniture, and even family heirlooms. His kingdom lived in fear of him randomly declaring their belongings mystical and seizing them. The nobles eventually formed a coalition to gently persuade him to step down, disguising the overthrow as voluntary enlightenment. But scandal took many shapes, and not all were fueled by vanity or delusion. King Ulder the Whisperer was infamous not for what he did openly, but for what he did in secret. His reign was threaded with rumors of hidden tunnels beneath the castle, where he allegedly spied on his own court. Some said he had appointed a network of informants disguised as gardeners, musicians, and even monks. His paranoia grew until he trusted no one but his pet's 2 ravens named Truth and Lies. Ulder's downfall began when he overheard a conversation between 2 knights discussing his recent policies. They criticized his harsh taxes and whispered that the king had lost touch with the people. Ulder, convinced it was a conspiracy, imprisoned not only the knights but their families, their friends, and anyone who had spoken to them within the last month. His prisons overflowed, chaos erupted, and soon the entire kingdom was drowning in suspicion. His most infamous moment came during a grand feast meant to celebrate peace with a neighboring kingdom. Instead of raising a toast to unity, Ulder stood up and accused half the guests of plotting against him. After a night of frantic accusations and guests fleeing the palace in terror, no peace treaty was ever signed. The neighboring kingdom retaliated months later. Then there was King Rovan the Unready, whose reign became a comedy of errors. Rovan was kind-hearted but disastrously incompetent. He once attempted to lead an army without knowing how to mount a horse. He tried and failed to read a map upside down during a crucial strategy meeting. He accidentally gave land grants to the wrong village, creating a decade-long feud between 2 towns. His most notorious scandal occurred during a coronation anniversary celebration. Rovan attempted to release trained doves as a symbol of unity, but the cages were mistakenly filled with angry geese. The ceremony dissolved into chaos as nobles fled from feathered fury. Rovan's court chroniclers often rewrote events to protect his image, but the kingdom's storytellers remembered every mishap, passing them down in exaggerated tales that painted Rovan as a king whose reign was a constant series of unfortunate events. But perhaps the strangest figure was King Marcellin, the dream-touched. Marcellin ruled with the guidance of visions that came to him in dreams. Sometimes his dreams led to wisdom. Other times they plunged the nation into baffling crisis. One year, Marcellin dreamed that the moon had fallen from the sky because the kingdom's ships were too heavy. In response, he ordered all naval vessels to be stripped of their cannons. Pirates celebrated for years. Another time, Marcellin dreamed that he had been visited by a giant talking fish who told him the kingdom should ban all fishing for a season. The people protested, but Marcellin insisted the fish was right. For months, fishermen starved while Marcellin hosted feasts featuring imported seafood, claiming it did not violate the decrees since the fish were foreign and therefore uninvolved in the prophecy. His most scandalous decision came when he erected a giant statue of a dream figure he believed represented fate itself. The statue was so tall that it blocked sunlight to half the capital, creating a perpetual shadow over the marketplace. Merchants rioted, crops withered, and Marcellin, confused but determined, ordered an even larger statue built to restore balance. It fell apart in a storm within weeks. As centuries passed, the stories of these kings intertwined in the minds of historians, forming a tapestry of madness, vanity, fear, arrogance, and foolishness. Yet none stood alone. For every scandalous king, there were courtiers who encouraged their flaws. advisors who feared their wrath and subjects who suffered the consequences. Together, these tales painted a vivid picture of the medieval world, not as a realm of pure nobility and chivalry, but as a place where human flaws shaped destinies as surely as swords and crowns. Kingdoms rose and fell on the whims of rulers who were more eccentric than legendary, more troubled than wise, and more scandalous than anyone dared admit. And so, as the scribe reached the end of the ancient scroll, he gently rolled it closed. These stories, though bizarre, served as reminders that power magnifies every flaw, and that even kings could become prisoners of their own impulses. The torch flickered one final time, casting long shadows across the stone chamber. In those dancing shapes lay the legacies of the most scandalous kings the medieval world had ever known, men whose misjudgments echoed through time, reminding future generations that sometimes the greatest threats to a kingdom were seated not on the battlefield, but on the throne itself. The scribe thought he had reached the end, yet the scroll he held felt heavier than before, as though the weight of more unspeakable stories lived within the parchment. When he turned it over, he found a second layer hidden beneath the first, sealed with wax, marked with the emblem of a broken crown. His hand trembled. Only records too scandalous for royal archives were ever sealed with such a symbol. He cracked the seal and continued reading. There was King Harwin, the collector of faces, a ruler whose obsession with portraits bordered on madness. Unlike Rodrian the Golden, who loved vanity, Harwin feared obscurity. He believed that to be forgotten was a second death, far worse than any mortal end. So he hired artists from every corner of the known world to paint him daily, not yearly, not monthly, daily. Entire wings of the palace were filled with canvases depicting Harwin in slightly different poses, expressions, or angles. He would inspect each portrait with feverish intensity, demanding corrections for details a normal eye would never catch. But Harwin's scandal came not from the portraits, but from what he did with the artists. He locked them inside the palace for years at a time, convincing himself that if they ever left, foreign kingdoms might seek them out and distort his likeness. And so painters lived as prisoners among their own art, whispering their despair between brushstrokes. When one artist attempted escape, Harwin panicked, convinced that the man would spread lies about his face. She ordered the palace gates, reinforced with iron, not to keep enemies out, but to keep artists in. His reign ended when the palace caught fire and thousands of portraits burned to ash. As flames devoured his life's obsession, Harwin collapsed in the courtyard, surrounded by melting paints and drifting ashes of his own image. When the fire was extinguished, not a single portrait survived. Harwin was remembered after all, but only as a king consumed by his fear of being forgotten. The scroll unfurled to reveal another tale, the story of King Yoren the Reformer, who believed he could fix humanity through extreme, bewildering policies. He banned sighing for an entire year, claiming it drained the kingdom's morale. Anyone caught sighing in public was fined. His second decree was even stranger. All citizens had to smile while walking through the capital. Guards were ordered to patrol the streets and ensure no frowns existed within the city walls. Children made wooden smile masks to avoid punishment. Merchants painted grins onto their shop signs. Yoren's most infamous scandal involved his attempt to standardize walking speed. He believed inconsistent pacing created social chaos, so he introduced the Great Stride Law, which dictated exactly how many steps a citizen must take per minute. Violators were stopped, corrected, and sometimes escorted to pacing schools. Travelers avoided the kingdom entirely rather than endure the bizarre laws. Eventually, the entire city erupted in protest, not with weapons, but with synchronized sighs. Thousands gathered in the square and sighed loudly, breaking his first decree in unison. Faced with the sound of collective defiance, Yoren fled the palace, leaving behind a legacy defined not by reform but by relentless absurdity. Then came the tale of King Serene the Scholar King, whose intellect was unmatched but whose common sense was tragically lacking. Serene adored books more than people. He filled his palace with libraries that climbed to the ceilings, books stacked like towers, scrolls piled like sand dunes. He believed that any problem in the world had already been solved in some forgotten text. He just needed to find it. But Serene's obsession led him to catastrophe. When a drought struck the kingdom, he refused practical solutions. Instead, he ordered every fountain drained so he could store water in massive clay jars, convinced that an ancient manuscript warned that fountains tempt the wrath of the sky. The jars cracked under the sun, losing half the kingdom's water reserves. When famine followed, Serene turned not to farmers but to his books, insisting that a secret agricultural method lay buried in the palace archives. He found a recipe for a miracle crop, planted it across the countryside, and waited proudly for the harvest. What grew was not food but a useless weed that spread rapidly, choking farmland. And yet he never understood his own failure. His final decree was to build the world's largest library tower, a spire of knowledge that nearly collapsed under its own weight before it was completed. When the tower finally crumbled in a storm, it buried hundreds of priceless books beneath the ruins. Serene, sitting amid the rubble, murmured that the collapse was symbolic, and that greater wisdom would rise from its ashes. The kingdom disagreed and gently removed him from power before he could consult another manuscript. Further down the scroll lay the tales of King Valeric the Magnificent, whose name was perhaps the most misleading in royal history. Valeric believed deeply in theatrics. He adored parades, ceremonies, grand entrances, and dramatic speeches. Every royal gesture had to be spectacular. He spent more time practicing his kingly wave than governing the nation. His robes grew heavier each year, layered with jewels and medals until he needed attendants just to lift his sleeves. The height of Valeric's scandal came during a diplomatic summit. He wanted to impress his guests with the grand entrance of ages, a procession involving dancers, gold chariots, fireworks, and a musical ensemble of 300 players. But the fireworks ignited too early, the dancers collided, and the horses pulling the chariots panicked, bolting in every direction. Instruments shattered, nobles fled for safety, and the carefully choreographed spectacle erupted into a scene of pure chaos. Valeric, refusing to accept failure, insisted on reenacting the entrance the following day. His guests declined. Not all kings scandalized through foolishness. Some did so through cruelty wrapped in extravagance. King Solmer the Iron-Handed ruled with authorities so rigid that even his own laws suffocated the kingdom. Solmer believed punishment must always match inconvenience. If someone arrived late to a meeting, he made them stand outside the palace for hours. If a merchant overcharged for wares, Solmer forced them to sell their goods for half the price for a month. These punishments spiraled until they turned absurd. One noble insulted the king's robe by saying it was a bit dull, and Solmer commanded him to wear only gray clothing for an entire year. But Solmer's greatest scandal came when he attempted to reorganize society based on personal worth. He placed value ratings on every citizen, assigning numbers from 1 to 10 based on their perceived usefulness. This led to chaos as people competed, bribed, or sabotaged each other to improve their rankings. Families split, friendships collapsed, and towns erupted in rivalry. Solmer's system crumbled when the people revolted, not violently, but by publicly rejecting the numbers. They covered walls with paint, tore down ranking boards, and refused to acknowledge the scale. Solmer, realizing he had lost control, attempted one final decree, a mandatory celebration in his honor. No one attended. His power ended not with a battle, but with a silent square and a king staring at an empty festival ground. The scroll continued. King Belthram the Blessed was anything but blessed. He believed himself divinely chosen and spent his reign seeking signs of heavenly approval. He interpreted random events as messages from above. A fallen tree meant plant more orchards. A sudden rainstorm meant cancel all trade. A shooting star meant raise taxes. His kingdom endured constant changes, laws rewritten weekly, policies reversed monthly. Belthram's greatest scandal arrived with the sacred goat. One spring day, a goat wandered into the palace gardens, and Belthram declared it a holy messenger. He built it a miniature throne, issued decrees interpreted through the goat's behavior, and cancelled meetings if the goat appeared displeased. When the goat escaped the palace and joined a herd outside the city, Belthram insisted on identifying the true one among dozens of almost identical goats. The fiasco lasted a week and ended with Belthram declaring all goats sacred, which led to farms being overrun. His advisors finally convinced him to abdicate, assuring him that the heavens had other tasks for him. Belthram left peacefully, still searching for divine signs. At last, the scroll approached its final, most ominous tale, the story of King Fenric, the severed crown. Fenric's scandals were subtle, quiet, and deeply unsettling. He had a habit of cutting the tops off crowns, real crowns, because he believed no ruler should trap the spirit of leadership beneath metal. Every ceremonial crown in the kingdom ended up with its top removed, reshaped into strange, jagged models that appeared more like broken helmets than symbols of power. His advisors pleaded with him to stop, but Fenric insisted it was symbolic liberation. His strangest scandal came with the silent court, a policy where no one could speak during meetings unless Fenric granted permission with a small silver bell. He rang it at random intervals, sometimes not at all. Hours passed in tense, suffocating silence while Fenric stared into nothingness, waiting for what he called the voice of truth. Important matters were delayed for weeks. Decisions went unmade, and the kingdom spiraled into confusion. When the nobles finally confronted him, Fenric stood atop the palace balcony, holding the last crown he had mutilated. He declared he would never wear a complete crown again, only fragments, to free the kingdom from the burden of expectation. His reign ended shortly after, but the image of a king wearing a half-destroyed crown lingered for generations. And so the scroll came to its end, but not its lesson. For woven through every tale was a truth the scribe understood only now, that even the greatest kingdoms rested on fragile foundations, easily shaken by ego, obsession, fear, or delusion. Thrones were heavy not because of gold, but because of the human flaws beneath them. The torch flickered low. The scribe rolled up the scroll one final time and placed it back among the forgotten records. He whispered into the dim hall, "May future kings read these stories and remember what power can do." The flame died, leaving only the echo of ancient scandals drifting through the stone chamber, ready to be retold for centuries to come. Yet something strange happened after the scribe replaced the scroll among the archives. As he turned to leave the chamber, a faint draft rustled through the stacks. One scroll long forgotten beneath a thick layer of dust slid slightly forward as though nudged by unseen hands. The scribe paused. He had never noticed this scroll before. Its seal was unlike the others. Dark red wax imprinted with the symbol of a serpent, devouring its own tail. That was the mark of Forbidden's chronicle stories intentionally erased from official history. He swallowed hard, reached for the scroll, and brushed dust from its surface. When he broke the seal, a cold whisper seemed to shiver through the room. The tales within were darker than any he had read. They began with King Arnulf the Masked. Arnulf never showed his face. He wore masks carved from bone, iron, gold, or even polished wood one for each day of the year, each painted with a different expression. No one alive had seen the king's true face, not even his closest advisors. Rumor claimed that Arnulf hid a terrible disfigurement. Others whispered he believed his face held an omen that would doom the kingdom. But the masks were only the beginning of his scandal. Arnulf governed through silence. He communicated exclusively through written notes delivered by masked attendants. His court never knew whether the king was present behind the mask of a servant or sitting behind a curtain, watching them with hidden eyes. Nobles lived in fear, unable to speak freely lest the king overhear through one of his disguised agents. Some claimed Arnulf walked the city at night wearing the mask of a commoner to listen to the people as conversations. Others said he replaced officials without warning, sending them away in darkness. His final scandal occurred during a grand festival. Arnulf appeared wearing a flawless silver mask, but beneath it, his voice trembled. Midway through his speech, something cracked. The mask fell, shattering on the stone floor. Gasps echoed across the plaza. But the face revealed was not terrifying, it was ordinary. Too ordinary, that was the scandal. For years, the entire kingdom had feared a monster. Instead, they found a man driven by paranoia, believing that an unremarkable face could not command awe. Arnulf fled in shame the same night, vanishing into the woods with only a handful of masks. His rule became a lesson whispered to future kings. Fear can twist even the simplest truths into shadows. The scroll continued with King Dorian the Dream Builder, a visionary whose imagination exceeded reality itself. Dorian believed he could reshape the world into a paradise of innovation. He hired engineers, artists, and philosophers to construct impossible inventions, flying machines powered by woven leather wings, towers taller than mountains, carriages that moved without horses. But none of it worked. His flying machine crashed spectacularly into the palace orchard, flattening the royal apple trees. His tower collapsed halfway through construction, burying the architect's plans forever. And his self-moving carriage, which used ropes wound by dozens of servants hiding inside a wooden compartment, broke apart in front of an audience of foreign guests. Yet Dorian insisted these failures were steps toward triumph. He poured the kingdom's treasury into more inventions, bankrupting half the noble families, until the people finally rebelled, not violently, but through refusal. Workers stopped appearing at the construction sites. Engineers left the capital. Dorian found himself alone among half-finished projects, towering like skeletal monuments to ambition gone wild. He died believing he was on the brink of greatness. Next came King Halvrik the Ever-Young, a ruler so terrified of aging that his scandals began with vanity but spiraled into madness. Halvrik outlawed mirrors older than 5 years, convinced they aged people faster. He forced the palace physicians to create potions promising youth, even though most were ineffective mixtures of herbs and honey. Worst of all, he hired alchemists who guaranteed age reversal, allowing them to perform bizarre experiments in the palace gardens. When the potions failed, Halvrik blamed time itself. He decreed that the kingdom must eliminate reminders of age. No birthday celebrations, no historical monuments, no references to the past. Elderly nobles were quietly dismissed from the court. Libraries removed books that described long-dead kings. His greatest scandal emerged when he attempted to outlaw the concept of years entirely, replacing them with cycles of youthfulness. Confusion gripped the kingdom. Trade contracts became meaningless. Taxes were impossible to calculate, and no one knew how old their children were. The chaos ended only when Halvrik mysteriously disappeared during a lunar festival. Some claimed he had ventured into the mountains seeking eternal youth. Others whispered that he had simply succumbed to the very thing he feared. Then came King Audrin the Listener, a king who heard too much. Audrin believed every voice in his kingdom mattered, so he invited citizens to speak their minds. At first this seemed noble, but soon the palace was swarmed by people seeking audience. Farmers complained about weather, merchants reported petty disputes, children argued over toys. Audrin listened to everything, believing each concern shaped the kingdom's destiny. His scandal began when he attempted to respond to every voice. Policies changed daily. If a shepherd complained about wolves, Audrin organized a kingdom-wide wolf hunt. When a baker argued that bread should be softer, Audrin decreed new standards for flour. Someone joked that goats looked like spies. Audrin briefly outlawed goats. Advisors begged him to stop. But Audrin insisted that ignoring a single voice was equivalent to betraying the kingdom. Overwhelmed, sleep-deprived, and increasingly paranoid, Audrin finally collapsed from exhaustion after hearing 10,000 complaints in a single week. His people gently removed him from power, acknowledging that even the most attentive ruler cannot carry the weight of every whisper. Further down the scroll lay the story of King Tavrion the Gambler, whose decisions were determined not by counsel or wisdom, but by games of chance. Tavrion kept dice in his throne room, cards in his pockets, and a spinning wheel beside his bed. When ambassadors arrived, he decided their treaties by flipping coins. When generals asked for orders, he rolled dice to determine strategies. The scandal reached its peak during a war with a neighboring kingdom. Instead of drafting a military plan, Tavrion played a card game with his advisors. He declared that if he won, the kingdom would attack at dawn. If he lost, they would surrender. The advisors rigged the game to ensure a peaceful outcome, but Tavrion caught them cheating and, in outrage, doubled the kingdom's taxes to fund an honor restoration festival. His gambling addiction escalated until he bet portions of his own kingdom during private games. When he lost a coastal province in a wager to a foreign noble, the people revolted. Tavrion escaped with nothing but a deck of cards and was never seen again. And then there was King Firen, the farsighted, whose visions extended so far into the future that he forgot to rule the present. Firen believed he had the gift of foresight and spent hours every day staring into a polished obsidian mirror, claiming he could see centuries ahead. He abandoned daily governance, insisting that immediate concerns were trivial compared to the grand future he envisioned. But Firen's prophecies were vague and confusing. He once predicted a great flood of darkness, prompting the kingdom to construct an elaborate irrigation system that ultimately failed when it turned out he had simply misinterpreted an eclipse. Another prophecy warned that a stranger with a crooked hat would doom the kingdom, leading to panic in the streets whenever someone wore unusual headgear. The greatest scandal came when Firen declared that the kingdom would soon ascend into an age of golden enlightenment. To prepare, he ordered the people to stop farming and focus solely on study and meditation. Within months, famine spread. Farran refused to change course, blaming the hunger on negative energies resisting enlightenment. His council eventually locked away the obsidian mirror, and without it, Farran's foresight vanished. The kingdom slowly returned to stability, while Farran spent his remaining years wandering the palace gardens, mumbling about futures that would never come. Finally, the scroll arrived at its most chilling tale: King Lorimir, the Quiet Flame. Lorimir was gentle, soft-spoken, and deeply beloved in his youth, but his scandals came not from cruelty or madness. They came from secrets buried beneath layers of calm composure. Lorimir had a habit of burning small things at first: letters, old garments, broken tools. He claimed fire symbolized renewal. But soon he began burning documents, archives, maps, even ancient statues. He destroyed anything that reminded him of past failures or future burdens. His advisors grew alarmed when he burned the kingdom's financial records to liberate the treasury from the weight of numbers. Merchants panicked when trade agreements vanished into ash. Farmers despaired when agricultural records turned to smoke. Lorimir insisted that a kingdom unburdened by the past could forge a better path, but without history, chaos followed. His final scandal came during a winter night when flames erupted across the palace. Lorimir stood before the inferno, watching calmly as the grand hall burned. He whispered that the kingdom needed a rebirth by fire. The palace was saved, but only after priceless artifacts were lost. Lorimir was removed from power the next morning, still murmuring about flames that cleansed the soul. The scroll ended abruptly after Lorimir's story, as though the scribe who wrote it had stopped mid-sentence or been interrupted. The scribe reading these tales felt a shiver run down his spine. These kings, forgotten by time but preserved in forbidden ink, represented extremes of human nature magnified by power. Each one had ruled with conviction, yet drowned in self-created chaos. As he rolled up the scroll, he understood the true purpose of these records: not to entertain, but to warn. For no kingdom falls in a single moment. It falls piece by piece through vanity, obsession, fear, pride, ambition, or delusion. And the most dangerous kings were not always cruel, nor foolish, nor wicked, but simply human. The scribe placed the scroll back among the shadows, whispered a silent prayer for future rulers, and stepped out of the chamber. Behind him, the archives settled into stillness, holding centuries of scandalous whispers in their depths, waiting for the next seeker brave enough to read them. And so the whispers of King Alexander's Jade Court continued to drift through the centuries, becoming more and more exaggerated with every retelling. But scandal, as always, has an endless supply of heirs, and other kings soon carved their names into the same shadowed wall of history, men whose reputations clung to them like smoke long after their crowns turned to dust. One such king was Roderick of Castama, remembered not for his laws or victories, but for the strange, flamboyant theatrics of his court. His palace was a stage on which he played more roles than a troupe of wandering actors. He changed personas with every passing season, one day appearing as a humble monk who demanded silence from all who approached him, the next day strolling across the throne room draped in silks imported from lands half a world away. Roderick believed that scandal was a form of statecraft. If his nobles were busy gossiping about him, they were too distracted to conspire against him, and to his credit, it worked. Roderick hosted midnight revels in the royal gardens, where the lamps burned green with the smoke of exotic herbs and musicians played hypnotic, spiraling tunes. Some said Roderick wanted to turn his entire palace into a place where the notion of day and night ceased to exist. Others claimed he feared the clarity of the sun and preferred the shadows, where every rumor took on new life. His most notorious habit was the Wheel of Appearances, a giant wooden disc painted with 6 exaggerated caricatures: the miser, the warrior, the poet, the hermit, the merchant, and the fool. Once a week, the king spun it before the gathered court, and became whichever persona the wheel demanded. For the entire day he would speak, decide, judge, and command in the manner of that character no matter the consequences. Treaties were written in rhyme, tax codes were dictated as riddles, and generals were forced to receive battle orders written in elaborate metaphors. His advisors lived in constant dread of the fool, and yet the kingdom never collapsed. Roderick's unpredictable nature kept rival lords guessing, while foreign emissaries returned home to report that Castama was ruled by a man so baffling, so uncontrollable, that to cross him might invite chaos rather than war. Scandal insulated him better than any fortress. But if King Roderick turned rumor into a political weapon, then Queen Adelaide of Harrowmore turned it into a labyrinth. Her reign was a maze of secrets, half-truths, and deliberate illusions. She cultivated an aura of mystique so deep that she seemed almost otherworldly to those who served her. Harrowmore Castle was filled with hidden corridors, mirrors that revealed other mirrors, and rooms arranged to produce echoes where no footsteps existed. Visitors often left convinced they had seen more than one Adelaide or that she moved through walls like a ghost. Adelaide never walked anywhere without a cloak of whispering attendants behind. Her courtiers specifically chosen for their ability to speak in soft, drifting murmurs that could never quite be understood, but always suggested something dramatic. Poison, someone might hear. Or betrayal, or tonight. These whispers were a trap and the queen wielded them like daggers. Her greatest scandal came from her Book of Reflections, a massive ledger in which she recorded the fears, ambitions, and rumors of every noble in her realm. She collected information with obsessive devotion, scribbled notes about who visited whom after sunset, which lord had grown suddenly wealthy, which lady had dismissed a servant too abruptly, which knight was seen praying too often or not enough. She demanded confessions from her advisors on a weekly basis, asking them to speak their darkest thoughts while standing before a silver mirror polished so brightly that they could see every trembling detail of their own expression. Predictably, word of the book leaked. Some believed it contained sorcery. Others believed it held the true power of Harrowmore, greater than any army. Nobles tried to steal it, bribe their way into its pages, or destroy it altogether. But the queen outplayed them all, for she kept multiple false versions scattered across the castle, each one filled with fabricated secrets carefully designed to expose traitors. Anyone who attempted to use one of the decoy books soon found themselves trapped in a web of their own ambition. Adelaide's rule thrived on scandal, suspicion, and the constant tension of not knowing where the truth ended and illusion began. It was said that she understood something other monarchs rarely grasped, that human beings fear rumors more than facts, shadows more than torches, and the unknown more than the known. But while kings like Roderick and queens like Adelaide weaponized scandal, others became prisoners of it. And none better embodied this fate than King Everard the Unready, a monarch whose every attempt at dignity somehow resulted in accidental chaos. Everard was earnest, well-meaning, and disastrously clumsy. His scandals were never intentional, they simply seemed to find him, like bees to a flowering meadow. He once tripped during a coronation procession and rolled down the palace steps so dramatically that foreign ambassadors believed he had been assassinated. Courtiers still spoke of the time he accidentally signed a trade agreement upside down, leading neighboring kingdoms to assume it was a coded threat. And then there was the festival incident, when he attempted to release a ceremonial dove only to discover it was, in fact, a furious goose. But Everard's greatest unintentional scandal came during a state dinner meant to solidify a fragile alliance. In an effort to appear dignified, he practiced his posture for days. He rehearsed his greetings, memorized diplomatic phrases, and even wore shoes half a size too small because they made him stand straighter. It was all going well until a servant carrying a bowl of soup stumbled, forcing Everard to leap aside. His too tight shoes caused him to lose balance, at which point he instinctively reached for the nearest support, the visiting king. Both rulers toppled into the soup. The incident became known across the region as the Broth Treaty, and though Everard's counselors tried desperately to salvage the diplomatic disaster, the damage was done. Songs were written about it. Children reenacted it in the streets. Everard himself could not escape the humiliation, and rumors spread that he was cursed by some ancient spirit of embarrassment. Yet strangely, his people loved him for it. His scandals were harmless, human, and oddly endearing. He reminded his subjects that behind every crown was a person flawed, awkward, and desperately trying to navigate the impossible. But rulers did not need to be clumsy to attract scandal. Sometimes their own intelligence led them astray. King Maloran the Archivist, for example, was consumed by an obsession with preserving every detail of his reign. He believed that future historians would ignore everything except what was written down, so he wrote down everything. His scribes were forced to record not only battles and policies, but also his daily meals, dreams, passing thoughts, and impulsive observations on the facial hair of his nobles. The archive grew so massive that it required an entire wing of the palace, with shelves stretching floor to ceiling and ladders built into rails. Maloran demanded total accuracy, so scribes wrote furiously as he paced back and forth, narrating every moment of his life. But this relentless documentation created its own scandals. Private conversations wound up in the records. Personal letters were archived. Unfinished plans for new laws were mistaken for official decrees. The people eventually protested, claiming the king had turned the kingdom into a stage where every citizen was a character, their actions preserved whether they wished it or not. The breaking point came when a scribe accidentally recorded a sarcastic remark from Maloran as a royal proclamation. Overnight, half the kingdom believed they had been ordered to hang fish from their doorways to ward off political complacency. The chaos that followed was legendary, and Maloran, realizing his mistake, sealed the archive and vowed never to add to it again. But the archive was not done causing scandal. Generations later, it was discovered by scholars who were stunned by its contents. The kingdom's history had been documented so thoroughly, yet so absurdly, that it became impossible to separate fact from Maloran's eccentric tangents. Historians argued for decades over which events were real and which were simply the king's meandering thoughts. Maloran's obsession had created a legacy of confusion, and his scandal lived on not through what he wrote, but through the chaos that followed. And still, the story of medieval scandal did not end there. For every king who courted rumor, there was another who tried and failed to escape it. For every queen who manipulated illusion, there was another who found herself trapped in her own myth. Scandal moved through the medieval world like a restless spirit, sometimes playful, sometimes cruel, but always hungry for a new name to claim. As stories of King Maloran's tangled archives settled into legend, whispers rose of yet another ruler whose scandals shaped the fate of his kingdom, not through excess or clumsiness, but through fear itself. This was King Ron of the Iron Valleys, a man whose reign was marked by suspicion, omens, and a belief that danger lurked in every corner of his castle. Unlike Roderick, who embraced chaos, or Adelaine, who cultivated illusion, Ron believed scandal was a shadow that followed him, one he could never outrun. From the moment he ascended the throne, he was haunted by the idea that someone, perhaps everyone, was plotting against him, and so his rule became a theater of paranoia. Ron ordered the construction of a network of concealed passageways throughout the palace, each one leading to a tiny chamber where spies sat silently in the dark, listening to conversations through hidden slits in the walls. These watchers were not permitted to speak, not even to each other. Their sole purpose was to observe, memorizing every detail for the king's nightly interrogations. Ministers learned to choose their words carefully, for they never knew when a seemingly harmless joke might be twisted into something treasonous. A whisper about the weather could be interpreted as a coded message. A cough could be mistaken for a signal. Servants moved through the palace with bowed heads, terrified that a simple misstep might land them in the king's suspicion book, a thick journal filled with names, dates, and imagined offenses. But Ron's most notorious creation was the Hall of Silence, a long corridor lined with mirrors that faced inward. Each mirror was polished to a blinding sheen, reflecting reflections endlessly. Ron believed that walking through the corridor cleansed him of lies, an eccentric ritual that his advisors reluctantly adopted. Guests invited to the palace were required to pass through the corridor before meeting the king, emerging pale and nervous, convinced that the mirrors had revealed their innermost thoughts. The scandal that cemented Ron's reputation came during a diplomatic summit. Representatives from 4 neighboring kingdoms were invited to negotiate a peace agreement. In an effort to ensure no one plotted behind his back, Ron ordered his spies to secretly record every private conversation in the palace. But the secret rooms had grown damp and the wax tablets used for note-taking had softened in the humid air. When Ron demanded to hear the reports, all that remained were smudged lines and indistinct markings. Ron, convinced the ambassadors had spoken in riddles designed to evade his surveillance, erupted in fury. He accused them of deception, tore up the peace proposal, and threw the summit into chaos. The guests returned home with tales of a king who saw treachery in every shadow, and Ran's kingdom soon found itself isolated, surrounded by neighbors who now viewed him as dangerously unstable. Yet in truth, Ran never sought scandal. It clung to him like ivy on an old stone wall, growing slowly, twisting deeper, becoming impossible to remove. His own fear became the scandal, and his legacy became a warning that sometimes the greatest danger a king faces is the ghost he creates within his own mind. Far from the Iron Valleys, in a lush coastal kingdom warmed by southern winds, another ruler's scandals took a very different form. King Adrian the Magnificent earned his title not from greatness, but from his unbridled passion for spectacle. To Adrian, everything from a simple banquet to a royal decree was an opportunity for dramatic flair. His palace was a sprawling mosaic of gold leaf, glass towers, and fountains that sprayed colored water into the air. He believed that the more extravagant the display, the more loyal his people would become. And so, Adrian invented festivals for every imaginable purpose. There was the Festival of Flourishing Feathers, where citizens wore bird-themed costumes. The Feast of Brilliant Breads, where bakers shaped loaves into animals. And the Night of Glorious Flames, during which the sky was lit with towers of burning incense. The king walked among the crowds wearing elaborate cloaks stitched with reflective stones that glittered in torchlight like shards of sunlight. But spectacle became scandal when Adrian's obsession grew too large for the kingdom to sustain. He commissioned a massive parade platform carved from a single block of imported marble, but the structure was so heavy that it cracked the streets. He ordered the creation of a floating garden on the bay, but the garden's weight caused it to sink during a royal procession, sending guests into the water. Worst of all was his attempt to construct a tower tall enough to touch the lower whispers of the heavens. The tower collapsed halfway through its construction, prompting the king to declare that the heavens must have disliked the color of the stone. The treasury drained, merchants complained, and nobles whispered that the king's brilliance had given way to delusion. But Adrian, ever theatrical, paid little mind. He believed that scandal was merely proof that people were paying attention. His most infamous moment occurred during a diplomatic visit from a northern queen. Hoping to impress her, Adrian staged a grand performance featuring a mechanical dragon built by the kingdom's finest artisans. It was meant to glide across the courtyard, breathe harmless bursts of colored smoke, and bow before the queen. Instead, one of the gears jammed. The dragon lurched forward, its smoke valves sputtering uncontrollably. The queen's attendants panicked, guards drew steel, and Adrian's masterpiece collapsed in a heap of metal and embarrassment. For years afterward, the northern court joked about the king who tried to impress a queen with a drunken dragon. Thus Adrian's name passed into legend, not as a tyrant or a hero, but as a king whose love of spectacle carried him far beyond the boundaries of reason. Yet if Adrian lived in a world of excess, King Halric of the Stormlands ruled in a realm of severity. His scandals emerged not from indulgence, but from his unyielding devotion to order. Halric believed that every element of life, behavior, appearance, customs, and even emotions should be governed by strict rules. He created a book of conduct that dictated everything from how citizens should greet one another to which colors could be worn on which days of the week. He established inspectors who roamed the streets, measuring the length of cloaks, ensuring the proper placement of belt buckles, and verifying that all citizens adhered to the approved list of acceptable facialities for public settings. Smiling too broadly was considered disorderly. Frowning without permission was discouraged. Laughing was permitted only during the designated hours of leisure. His court became a place where nobles constantly corrected themselves, straightening their posture, adjusting their sleeves, moderating their tone of voice, while Halric observed them like a hawk perched atop the throne. The scandal arose when Halric attempted to implement a kingdom-wide ritual called the Great Harmonizing, in which all citizens were required to recite a series of affirmations at sunrise. But the ritual was so long, so precisely timed, and so strictly monitored that people began oversleeping from exhaustion. Productivity fell, trade slowed, and the kingdom's farmers, forced to participate before tending their fields, saw their harvests begin to fail. The final blow to Halric's reputation came during a noble gathering. He delivered a lengthy speech on the importance of order only, to trip over the hem of his own perfectly regulated ceremonial robe and tumble down the steps of his throne. The entire hall gasped, terrified of reacting improperly. Halric's attempt to recover his dignity only made matters worse, as he insisted on continuing the speech while limping, pretending that nothing had happened. Rules, it seemed, could not save him from scandal. And so the tapestry of medieval rulers grew richer, each king weaving their own threads of drama, some comedic, some tragic, some bewildering, others strangely admirable. Their scandals endured not because they were shameful, but because they revealed something deeper about the people who wore the crown. For power, in every age, has a way of magnifying human nature. And in these kings, in their eccentricities, obsessions, and fragile ambitions, we find reflections of the world they tried to rule, and the legends that outlived them. As Harik's kingdom buckled beneath the weight of his rigid expectations, the chronicles of medieval scandal traveled onward, settling next upon the tale of a king whose entire reign unfolded like a fable told around firelight. This was King Thalin of the Verdant Reach, a monarch whose scandals grew not from chaos nor cruelty, but from his obsessive love of nature, a passion so deep that it often blurred the line between wisdom and eccentricity. Thalin had been crowned at the height of spring, when the forests were in full bloom and the rivers ran bright with melted snow. He believed the natural world was more honest than any noble court, and so he sought counsel not from advisors in embroidered robes, but from druids, herbalists, wanderers, and forest mystics. The palace gardens, once a tidy display of exotic flowers, became a wild tapestry of creeping vines, towering sunbursts of blossoms, and fragrant herbs that spilled from every corner. His advisors worried when he began holding audiences outdoors, under ancient oaks whose branches formed natural canopies above the throne. Petitioners waited in long lines, swatting at insects, while squirrels and robins perched near the king as though they were part of the royal council. But the true scandal began with the tournament of beasts. Believing that animals deserved equal representation in matters of the kingdom, Thalin organized an unprecedented event, a grand competition where knights would not fight each other, but instead forged symbolic alliances with creatures of the land. Falcons soared through obstacle courses, sturdy mountain goats traversed precarious ledges, and sleek hounds raced across open fields. The problem, however, arose when Thalin insisted that each noble must present an animal companion of their own choosing. This demand led to chaos. Some nobles brought creatures entirely unsuited for royal presentation. A merchant arrived with a grumpy tortoise, a baron displayed a rather lazy pig, and one count attempted to tame a wild boar that quickly charged into the crowd, scattering onlookers like falling leaves in a storm. By the end of the spectacle, 4 tents had been trampled, 2 ambassadors had climbed a tree for safety, and the royal cook's prized vegetable stand lay in ruin. Thalin, delighted, declared the tournament a marvelous success. But scandal followed him still deeper into the woods of his imagination. Determined to strengthen the bond between his people and the natural world, he issued a decree that citizens must name a tree as their forest sibling and visit it weekly. While the idea was poetic, the implementation was anything but. Arguments broke out over who could claim which tree. Families quarreled over the most convenient patches of forest, and one unfortunate row sparked between 2 noble women who insisted the same oak spoke to them more clearly. The king's eccentric policies reached their peak when he attempted to communicate directly with the spirit of the valley through a ritual involving incense made from rare herbs. When the ceremony produced a series of strange, echoing whistles in the canyon below, Thalin proclaimed he had received a message from the wind. His council was less convinced, particularly when he attempted to pass new laws based on the valley's whispered advice. Word spread quickly across neighboring realms. King Thalin had grown so close to nature that he now sought legal counsel from breezes and birdsong. But despite the ridicule, the people loved him. They saw in him a gentleness that set him apart from harsher rulers, and though his policies often caused confusion, they were born from a heart that wished only to draw man and world closer together. Far less gentle was King Severic the Red-Mantled, whose scandals erupted like storms across the plains he ruled. Severic was known for his fiery temper, which burned as fiercely as the crimson cloak he wore on every occasion. The cloak itself became part of his legend. It trailed behind him like a tongue of flame, and some said he wore it even while bathing. Severic believed that anger was a form of strength, and he used it as a tool of governance. His outbursts were so frequent and theatrical that his court developed an unspoken system for anticipating them. Advisors watched for the subtle twitch of an eyebrow, the tightening of his jaw, or the way his hand brushed the edge of his cloak. These signs allowed them a few precious seconds to brace themselves or to flee. The scandal that spread farthest, however, was not his temper itself, but his insistence on dramatic punishments for trivial offenses. When a court musician played a sour note during a banquet, Severic banished him to a remote lighthouse to contemplate the waves until he learns rhythm. When a noble arrived late to a council meeting, Severic demanded that every clock in the palace be dismantled and inspected for treachery. But the most infamous incident came during a diplomatic gathering. A visiting ambassador inadvertently complimented the beauty of Severic's cloak by calling it splendidly orange. The king froze. Orange, in his mind, was an insult, too close to red, yet lacking its dignity. Outraged, Severic delivered a lengthy speech on the meaning of true colors, ending by ordering the ambassador to spend the next hour in the palace orchard, reflecting on the difference between oranges and flames. The ambassador complied, bewildered, and the story traveled across kingdoms like wildfire. Severic's reputation became a mix of admiration and disbelief. Admiration for his unwavering conviction, disbelief at his volcanic pettiness. But none of these rulers, no matter how extravagant their scandals, matched the strange legacy of King Fenric of the moonlit coast, a man whose reign was marked not by public flamboyance but by the curious rituals he conducted at night. Fenric believed that the moon's phases influenced not only the tides, but the fortunes of entire kingdoms. And so he created a nocturnal court gathering that met only under moonlight, with lanterns shaded in blue silk to mimic the glow of the night sky. His daytime court handled ordinary matters, but the nocturnal court oversaw decisions of mystic significance, which often overlapped with everything from taxation to diplomacy. The king kept astronomers on constant retainer, forcing them to chart every flicker of starlight. A treaty could not be signed unless the moon was in the correct quadrant. A new road could not be built unless the stars aligned in a pattern Fenric deemed auspicious. Harvests could not begin until he observed the moon's reflection in a silver bowl of water, a ritual that grew increasingly absurd during cloudy seasons when Fenric insisted on climbing towers to catch even the faintest glimpse of moonlight. His most infamous scandal came when he attempted to realign the kingdom's entire calendar based solely on lunar cycles. Farmers were confused, merchants outraged, and priests bewildered by the sudden shift in holy days. For 3 months, the kingdom lived in a state of temporal chaos, unsure whether to trust the sun, the moon, or their own memories. Yet despite his oddities, Fenric's nocturnal court became the stuff of legend. Travelers spoke of ceremonies where the king wore robes stitched with tiny mother-of-pearl beads that shimmered like stars of councils held in open courtyards where participants sat in silence listening to the waves crash below the cliffs, waiting for Fenric to interpret the sky. And so the chronicles of scandal marched onward, each king leaving behind a legacy of bewilderment, laughter, admiration, or disbelief. For in the medieval world, scandal was not merely a stain upon a ruler's name. It was the thread that wove their stories into the great tapestry of history. Across every kingdom, from storm-racked cliffs to whispering forests, from rigid courts to chaotic festivals, rulers carved their own legends. Some through excess, some through fear, some through eccentricity, and some through sheer human folly. And still, many more kings would rise, each stranger, more unpredictable, or more tragically flawed than the last. The chronicler inhaled deeply, his fingers hovering over the parchment, as if afraid the ink itself might burst into flame from the weight of the tales he was preparing to record. For as he journeyed deeper into the hidden vaults of old European memory, he discovered that the truth behind medieval kings with infamous reputations was far stranger and far more revealing than the salacious rumors that had survived the centuries. For every whispered accusation, for every scandalous poem sung by rivals and mocking minstrels, there was always a shadow lying behind it. A political plot, a noble's ambition, or a churchman's attempt to control a king's will. And so the chronicler pressed on, determined to uncover not what made these rulers perverted by legend, but what made them human beneath the swirling fog of their reputations. He began with the tale of King Aldebrand of the Iron Coast, a ruler so frequently slandered in medieval taverns that even peasants could recite the rumors by heart. They said Aldebrand held moonlit gatherings in his cliffside fortress, surrounding himself with exotic entertainers brought from distant lands. They whispered that he roamed the halls at night wearing gold masks, drifting between rooms scented with incense and spiced wine. But the chronicler discovered something else. Aldebrand's court had been a refuge for musicians, actors, dancers, poets, and scholars fleeing persecution. To the envious nobility, such a free, lively court was an insult, a threat, a scandal waiting to be weaponized. And so the rumors spread, not because Aldebrand was depraved, but because he had dared to create a kingdom of art in an age fearful of imagination. The chronicler continued. There was King Thibaut of Ardennes, remembered not for the laws he passed or the treaties he secured, but for the strange tales that painted him as a man of uncontrollable indulgence. Yet when the chronicler examined letters, diaries, and the private confessions of monks who served at Thibaut's court, a very different image emerged. Thibaut had been lonely, profoundly so. A king raised among advisors instead of parents, surrounded by constant flattery and false smiles. His search for companionship, interpreted by jealous lords as a flaw, had been twisted into a legend of obsession. His name had become a cautionary tale, though the truth was simply that he had desired the friendship and affection that kings were rarely allowed to have. Further still, the chronicler dug, uncovering the saga of King Corvinus the Silk-Veiled, whose reputation had been deliberately tarnished by a coalition of church reformers intent on tightening their grip on the throne. They depicted him as a ruler drowning in excess, hosting feasts that lasted for days and encouraging behaviors described as shameful by the writers of his time. But hidden in the margins of an illuminated manuscript, the chronicler found a confession from one of Corvinus' own scribes. Corvinus had openly challenged the church's control over royal life. He refused to let clerics dictate his schedule, his celebrations, or his private gatherings. He had enjoyed music, dance, laughter, and color in a century that worshipped austerity, and for that, he had been labeled perverse. The chronicler wrote faster now, driven by a subtle anger at how history remembered men through the eyes of their enemies. He crossed kingdoms and borders, studying dusty scrolls, secret correspondence, forbidden books, and fading murals. And, with each tale, one truth grew stronger. The medieval world called many kings perverted, but the word rarely meant what it seems. Often, it simply meant they lived differently. They challenged the rules. They indulged in pleasures the nobility resented. They expressed emotions other monarchs kept hidden. They surrounded themselves with artists instead of warriors. They danced when the world expected them to stand still. And so their reputations became weapons. In smoky taverns, traveling storytellers embellished the rumors. In monasteries, monks exaggerated the sins of kings they disliked. In royal courts, political rivals sharpened accusations like knives. And across generations, exaggeration hardened into history. The chronicler began writing by candlelight, crafting a narrative that pulled together every thread, every misunderstood act, every misrepresented choice. He admitted the truths, yes. Some kings had their flaws, their vices, their indulgences, but none were the monsters painted by those who benefited from their downfall. Instead, they were complicated men trying to rule impossible kingdoms under impossible expectations. Toward the end of his work, he traveled to an abandoned fortress in the far north, where a final rumor awaited him, one of the most famous kings ever accused of perversion. His story was so distorted by centuries of gossip that few even remembered his real name. They called him the Velvet Tyrant. They said he filled his castle with strange mechanical devices, rare luxuries, and gatherings so unusual that no chronicler dared describe them fully. But the truth he uncovered was far more profound. The king had been a visionary and inventor, a collector of early scientific instruments, an experimenter whose curiosities frightened a world not ready for them. His devices were astronomical models. His scandals were foreign religion debates held in private chambers. His obsessions were studies of light, sound, and human behavior. And yet history remembered him only through mockery. The chronicler finally dipped his quill one last time, writing the message he hoped future generations would understand. A king remembered for scandal is often a king punished for being different. He closed the massive manuscript, its leather cover embossed with a simple symbol, a broken crown repaired with gold. A reminder that even flawed rulers deserve truth rather than rumor. As he left the quiet scriptorium, he whispered into the lantern-lit night, "Let this be the last time their names are chained to lies." And somewhere across the centuries, the forgotten kings of medieval legend seemed to breathe again, no longer as twisted figures of scandal, but as human beings whose stories had finally been restored to the light. Even as the chronicler sealed the manuscript, he knew there were more kings whose tales had been swallowed by rumor, forgotten, or deliberately erased. For every king remembered for scandal, there were 10 whose reputations had been rewritten by jealous courtiers, ambitious priests, or rival monarchs. And so he continued his journey through the dusty corridors of history, following whispers where they led. He came upon King Leofric the Silver-Handed, a ruler famed for his generosity, though in legend he was remembered as a debauched spender. Leofric had a hand made of silver after a hunting accident, and the chronicler initially assumed the stories of his extravagance involved gilded decadence. But as he pored over private accounts, letters, and merchant logs, the truth emerged. The silver hand itself was a symbol of his dedication. Every extravagant feast, every gift, every jewel was meant to secure loyalty and protect his people from famine, invasion, or rebellion. To a rival noble, this generosity seemed reckless, even scandalous, but to Leofric, it was survival. Next was King Bartholomew of the Glass Towers, whose scandals were whispered across Europe because of the unusual architecture of his castles. Every tower, every window, every ceiling had been constructed with panes of delicate, colored glass. Scholars mocked him for obsessing over vanity and light, while poets romanticized his castles as enchanted fortresses. Yet the truth was far more practical. The glass reflected sunlight into dark hallways, illuminated libraries at night, and allowed the king to observe his people without intrusion. But the misunderstanding spread, and Bartholomew's obsession with light became legend as a king too infatuated with spectacle. The chronicler smiled faintly as he read further, realizing that many of the perverted kings of legend had been misunderstood inventors, eccentric artists, or overly curious minds. History, after all, has a way of painting extremes instead of nuance, of turning creativity into scandal and ambition into vice. There was King Osric of the Twilight Hills, a king who allegedly held strange rites under the moonlight. The story had terrified generations, a ruler performing secret ceremonies with masked attendants in the dead of night. But the chronicler uncovered diaries, letters, and accounts from loyal attendants revealing the truth. Osric had simply been a patron of scholars who studied astronomy, herbal medicine, and natural philosophy. The so-called ceremonies were observational experiments tracking stars, testing herbs, measuring tides conducted at night to avoid distraction and ensure precise results. Yet legends had twisted science into scandal, turning a learned king into a figure of superstition and rumor. Then came King Valdemar the Whispered, whose entire court believed scandal followed him like a shadow. Valdemar was a subtle, calculating ruler who relied on intelligence, secret correspondence, and coded messages to maintain peace among feuding nobles. To outsiders, it looked as if he thrived on intrigue and perversion. But the chronicler discovered Valdemar's true skill. He had prevented countless uprisings and wars by maintaining control over information and ensuring that whispers never escalated into violence. His so-called scandals were mere misinterpretations of strategy. And finally, the chronicler arrived at the tale of King Ethelred of the Frosted Lands, a monarch whose legend was painted as bizarre indulgence. Ethelred's court had been accused of hosting strange entertainments in winter castles, where snow was carved into grotesque figures and elaborate games were played in ice halls. Yet surviving letters revealed a different picture. Ethelred's winters were harsh, and the snow festivals were created to bring joy to his people during months of darkness. The perversion of the court was nothing more than community spirit and inventive amusement. What the chronicler realized, once again, was that legend had taken something extraordinary and misunderstood it, leaving only the shadow of scandal behind. As the chronicler penned the final pages of his manuscript, he reflected on the patterns he had uncovered. These kings, though accused of perversion, eccentricity, or madness, had been rulers with ambition, curiosity, or compassion that exceeded the understanding of their contemporaries. Misunderstanding and exaggeration had transformed human complexity into legend, turning generosity into decadence, curiosity into obsession, and creativity into scandal. He wrote his final lines under the flickering candlelight. History remembers what it fears, exaggerates what it envies, and forgets what it cannot control. The kings who were called perverse were often the most human of all ambitious, curious, flawed, but visionary in ways the world was not ready to understand. He closed the manuscript carefully, knowing that future generations might read it and finally see the truth behind the myths. Outside, the night was silent. Somewhere, centuries of whispers faded, replaced by a quiet respect for the rulers who had lived, struggled, and dreamed under impossible crowns. And thus the story of the most scandalous, misunderstood, and perverted kings of medieval history came to rest not as tales of depravity, but as a reflection of ambition, imagination, and humanity itself. Even as the chronicler closed one manuscript, he knew the world still held kings whose stories had been twisted, hidden, or exaggerated. And so he turned to the northern realms, where King Alaric of the Frozen Fjords ruled. Alaric's legend was one of both awe and horror. Some said he wandered the frozen wilderness alone for months, conversing with the winds and the auroras while others claimed he summoned storms to punish his enemies. The truth was more subtle and far more human. Alaric had indeed spent long periods in the wilderness, but not out of cruelty, rather, out of reflection. He sought counsel from nature, mapping the stars and observing animal migrations to better understand the harsh northern lands he governed. Yet rumors of witchcraft and strange rituals spread quickly, fueled by priests and nobles who feared a king who acted independently, outside their influence. Next was King Mervin the Gilded, whose scandalous reputation centered on the opulence of his court. Chroniclers of later centuries painted him as a greedy tyrant, obsessed with gold and fine clothing. Yet surviving letters revealed a more complex reality. Mervin's gilded halls were designed to impress visiting envoys and deter invasion. The gold and jewels weren't for personal vanity, they were a tool of diplomacy. A single extravagant banquet could secure alliances that might otherwise have required war. Mervin's excess, misunderstood as indulgence, was in fact strategic, though the stories of his supposed perversion proved irresistible to storytellers and poets alike. Then came King Sigurd of the Blackwood, whose court was whispered to be a place of dark amusements and secretive gatherings. Minstrels sang of masked balls, forbidden intrigues, and scandalous nights in shadowed halls. But letters and diaries discovered in the archives painted a different picture. Sigurd's court was a center of literature, philosophy, and performance. The masked balls were not occasions of vice but elaborate theatrical productions, designed to entertain and educate both nobility and visiting scholars. His dark amusements were simply the arts misunderstood by generations of chroniclers eager for a sensational story. The chronicler paused, reflecting on the pattern that had emerged. So often, what was remembered as perverted behavior was nothing more than misinterpreted ambition, artistry, or intellect. The medieval world had no concept of nuance in scandal. Anything that deviated from the expected order became a story of excess, obsession, or moral failing. He continued with King Eldric of the Shimmering Isles, remembered in legend as a ruler who indulged in strange, otherworldly rituals. Minstrels and monks alike had spread stories of Eldric walking through halls lined with mirrors, whispering to the reflection of his advisors. But Eldric's journals revealed the truth. He was an early practitioner of psychological observation, studying human behavior, perception, and decision-making in ways centuries ahead of his time. The rituals were experiments in trust, persuasion, and diplomacy. The legends had transformed innovation into scandal. Further north, King Harland of the Windward Peaks earned a reputation as a recluse, obsessed with mechanical inventions. Rumors claimed he had strange contraptions in every hall, and some accused him of unnatural practices. But technical manuals and surviving sketches revealed a king fascinated by engineering, optics, and flight. He constructed watermills, mechanical clocks, and early gliders, pioneering designs that were too advanced for his contemporaries to understand. To those who could not comprehend his work, it became scandal. To the chronicler, it was genius misunderstood. Even beyond these rulers, the chronicler found tales of kings whose eccentricities had been amplified into legend. King Varric of the Silent Vale, who spoke only in measured tones to inspire contemplation. King Leintus of the Burning Hills, whose dramatic displays of fire were misunderstood experiments in metallurgy. And Queen Isolde of the Moonlit Keep, whose nocturnal councils of scholars were misinterpreted as secret scandalous rites. By the time the chronicler had reached the southernmost kingdoms, a pattern was undeniable. For centuries, the medieval world had exaggerated human ambition, creativity, and curiosity into scandal. Those who deviated from the expected behaviors of kingship, whether by innovation, generosity, or eccentricity, were remembered not for their achievements, but for the scandal surrounding them. He dipped his quill one final time and wrote, "The tales of perverted kings are not tales of vice, they are lessons in misunderstanding. History has labeled genius as madness, curiosity as obsession, and courage as scandal. The most human of kings were often the most misunderstood." The chronicler closed the final volume of his research. Outside, the wind whispered through the castle battlements, carrying faint echoes of centuries of kings eccentric, visionary, flawed, and now remembered for the first time with clarity. The legacy of scandal, he realized, was only as enduring as the stories told by those who survived them. And in that silence, the kings themselves seemed to breathe again, free from the shadows of rumor, each one finally restored to the truth of their humanity. As the chronicler laid down his quill for the final time, he reflected on the tapestry of rulers he had uncovered. From the flamboyant courts of Roderick and Audran to the introspective wilderness of Alaric and Thalin, from the rigid obsessions of Halric to the misunderstood ingenuity of Eldric, one truth had become abundantly clear. Scandal was not always sin, nor vice, nor depravity. It was often a mirror reflecting the world's fear, envy, and misunderstanding. Across the medieval world, stories had exaggerated gestures of power, creativity, and curiosity into legends of perversion. Generosity became greed, invention became unnatural obsession, ambition became cruelty. What was human was transformed into myth, what was brilliant was turned into scandal. And yet, through these distorted tales, the essence of each king survived, a testament to their boldness, their eccentricity, and their refusal to conform entirely to the expectations of their time. Some rulers had thrived on scandal, manipulating rumor and spectacle to control their courts and intimidate rivals. Others had fallen victim to it, their reputations twisted by fear, jealousy, or ignorance. Yet all of them shared one thing: they dared to be different, to act outside the narrow confines of what was acceptable, and in doing so, they left behind stories that have captivated generations. The chronicler imagined the whispers of history flowing across centuries, the laughter and fear, the envy and admiration, the rumor and truth, all interwoven into a single sprawling narrative. And in those whispers, a final lesson emerged for anyone who would listen. History is not a simple record of right and wrong. It is a reflection of human perception, flawed, biased, and endlessly fascinating. The kings who were called perverse were often only misunderstood. Their so-called scandals were the human echoes of ambition, creativity, and the struggle to navigate power in a world unready for them. As the candle burned low, the chronicler closed the last book, its cover embossed with a golden crown half shattered, half repaired, a symbol of imperfection, resilience, and humanity itself. Outside, the night was quiet. Yet somewhere across the centuries, the kings themselves seemed to breathe again. Not as villains or monsters, but as people eccentric, brilliant, flawed, ambitious, and alive in the stories that would never be fully forgotten. And so the tales of the most scandalous, most eccentric, most perverted kings of medieval history came to rest not as warnings, not as ridicule, but as a celebration of the strange, human, and profoundly complicated lives of those who wore crowns. For in the end, every crown casts a shadow, and every shadow tells a story. The end.